Welcome to this Venus Synodic Cycle Overview with Tami, Brunk, and me, Cayelin, Castell. And here on the first image you are seeing Venus in the morning sky with the waning crescent moon, and Venus in the evening sky with the waxing crescent moon. Of course, it's in different phases of their conjunction, but you'll notice that the waning crescent moon is facing one way and the waxing crescent moon is facing another way, and we're going to talk more about that as we do this overview. So just to kind of let you know what we're going to cover here, the first thing we'll cover is some of the goddesses that represent Venus through different cultures. We're also going to talk about the Venus cycle as initiation and the phases of the Venus cycle that include the morning star phase, the underworld phase, the evening star phase. So we'll go into detail about that. We'll also be talking about the Venus cycle and the mythic stories of Inanna and Ishtar, and how those stories are literal telling of the Venus cycle. What's happening with Venus in the sky is the same thing that's happening in these stories. So we're going to talk about that. It's very exciting to see those correlations and connections. And then the last thing we're going to talk about is the Venus overtones and how how they fit into the story, what the Venus overtones are, and how they mean something to us personally and collectively. So with that, I think we're ready to start with the many versions of the goddess that have represented Venus.
Okay, so throughout time, there have been many cultures across the globe that have seen Venus as representing a goddess, representing the sacred feminine. And so some of those, for example, include, as we will be discussing in greater depth, Inanna and Ishtar. Some others, from the Middle Eastern region, include Al-Uzza, to whom, according to some scholars, Mecca was originally dedicated, Astarte, Isis, Aphrodite, Persephone, Rhiannon, Lakshmi, Ereshkigal, Kali, Selene, Freya, Chaska, Varnamvir, Ishel, and many, many others. And just to pull a couple of these out, and Cayelin will also in a moment, Varnamvir is a really fascinating one that I discovered a couple of years back, who is an Australian, an Aboriginal goddess, and she was a morning star Venus, and she was the one who, according to some stories, drew the song lines across the earth that then created or emerged the landforms and the creatures and the humans and all of that. So even in Australia. And do you want to talk about some of the others?
Sure. So just we definitely have Middle Eastern, and we have Rhiannon, who is Celtic, Lakshmi from India, and Kali are also from India. Freya is Nordic, and Ishel is Mayan. So these are just a few examples, and of course there's a lot more, but just to kind of give you a sense of different cultures that have named their goddesses after Venus. And we're going to particularly be looking at, as Tami mentioned, the Inanna and Ishtar stories, and how that helps to inform our current understanding of the Venus cycle and how we're working with it at this time.
So the reason we are going to begin with Inanna, and the way this will work is, again, I'll just very briefly talk about the Venus cycle, or the Inanna story, and then we'll go more deeply into the Venus cycle itself and how it works. But the Inanna story, the Sumerian Inanna descent story, is very important because it's the only story that we know of where the Inanna descent story actually describes fully the entire Venus synodic cycle. And Cayelin and I have been working with this Venus cycle as an initiatory process by taking individuals and working ourselves ceremonially on a journey going through Inanna's 7 chakra gates. So basically in the story, Inanna passes through 7 gates on her way to and from the underworld. As she's descending, she descends into the underworld, she ascends, and in the descent phase, a vestment, she removes a vestment at each gate. She has to go through 7 gates. And on the ascent process, she reclaims the vestment at each gate. And the correlation to the Venus cycle is that on Inanna's descent, that is the morning star element of the Venus cycle. Her ascent is the evening star part of the journey. And the gates in the story represent Venus and the moon coming together in a conjunction, and that's related to the chakras. So the 7 gates, 7 Venus-Moon conjunctions are related to the 7 chakras. And then when Venus is in the underworld, that's when Venus is with the sun, and that's a time that Venus is not visible to human eyes. And so we will go more into depth with that story. But now Cayelin is going to begin to describe how the Venus synodic cycle actually works.
Yeah, so I'm going to give you some details, and it's not important that you have all of these details, but this is something you can come back and revisit, and of course over time, and as you work with the cycle ceremonially, you'll begin to understand more of these details because they'll become alive for you. So if you don't get it all now, that's okay. Just relax, take a breath. It's good. I've been working with the cycle for 20 years, and I'm always learning something new. So it's awesome that you get a chance to see this, especially in some of these visual ways I'm going to share with you. So the Venus cycle, the actual sort of down to the decimal point number of days that it lasts is 583.92 days. We just say 584 days because it's easier, so we've kind of rounded it up a little bit, but it's not exactly 584 days. Or about 19 months. It takes about 19 months. And in this first image here, you're seeing Venus retrograde. She's conjunct the sun in the underworld. Then she rises up as a morning star. That's where the cycle actually begins. Then she makes 7 or 8 moon conjunctions in the morning sky, disappears into the underworld, moves into the evening sky, goes retrograde, disappears, and then the cycle starts over again. So we're going to look at this in a little more detail, but that's just a quick overview of how the cycle works. And we do see that the cycle has specific phases. So there's the morning star phase. And that's when Venus is in the morning sky. She always enters the morning sky retrograde. She's there a few days and goes direct, and then she begins meeting with the moon. Then she goes into the long underworld, or it's there for about 3 months. 60 to 90 days is the numbers that we use for that, and those are sort of approximate. And then she moves into the evening sky phase. She meets with the moon 7 or 8 times, and after that she goes retrograde, and then she will disappear again below the horizon. So this is just a way for you to see how she rises up, how she disappears, how she rises up, how she disappears, just to kind of get a sense of that. But it's happening in different places in the sky. So right now, you might see Venus in the morning sky, or you might see Venus in the evening sky, or you might not be seeing Venus at all. So, and the reason is because she will be somewhere in one of these phases, and that will determine whether she's visible or not, and if she is visible, where she's visible. So this slide that we're looking at now is showing somebody standing on the earth and looking up at Venus in the sky. And so if you're looking to the right of the slide, you'll see Venus is in the evening sky, and then she drops down, and she'll actually pass between the sun and the earth. So she's moving between the sun and the earth, and then she rises up into the morning sky. And then in this image, you'll see that when Venus is here, when we're looking straight at the sun, of course, we're not going to see Venus because she's with the sun. She's in the glare of the sun. And then when Venus is in the morning sky, she actually goes around the back side of the sun, or the exterior side of the sun from where we are. So we don't see Venus there either. She's with the sun, but she's far away. So she's actually with the sun for a longer period of time. And then she appears in the evening sky. So what happens is that during this passage of Venus through these different phases, in the morning sky, she rises up and she'll make her greatest elongation. And what that means is this is when Venus is as far from the sun as she can get, or is as high on the horizon from Earth's perspective as we can see. So she rises up when she first comes up over the horizon. She's not, before the sun, she's not that far above the horizon. But over the next few weeks, she stretches out and can get as far as 48 degrees from the sun. And then she disappears behind the sun, and then she appears in the evening sky. But again, when she rises up into the evening sky, she's low on the horizon from the Earth's perspective. So over the next few weeks, she reaches her greatest elongation. And so the highest point in the sky that we'll see her, and then she begins to drop lower and lower until then she disappears into the underworld. So this is a little bit of how the astronomy works, and a way to get a visual about that, and the way that we, these things are all important to us in our understanding of how the Venus cycle works. So now we're ready to talk about Venus retrograde with the Sun.
Yes, so Venus is in a retrograde phase for about 40 days, not exact, but more or less. And during this period, Venus will disappear with the Sun, passing between the Sun and the Earth for about 7 or 8 days, and then is reborn anew in the morning sky, beginning a new cycle and ending the previous cycle. So, just to understand that better, when Venus begins she actually begins the retrograde phase of her cycle in the evening sky, and this is the point. It's kind of the ending of one cycle and the beginning of another. And so she begins her cycle in the evening sky, and then 16 days after Venus begins her retrograde journey, she disappears from the evening sky. That's the interior conjunction with the Sun that you saw in these earlier images, where Venus is crossing between the Earth and the Sun. And so it's a much shorter underworld journey, and that's when then is with the Sun for about 8 days, and then Venus will rise as in the morning sky, and that is the beginning of a new phase. That's when you first see her in the morning sky, and then she will go direct about 16 days later. So again, this is more or less average 16 days, 8 days, 16 days, and the number 8, as Cayelin will probably talk about as well, is kind of a magic number working with Venus. And so
right, so you notice that the Venus cycle is Venus is retrograde for 40 days. That is 5 times 8. 5 times 8 is 40, and then she's in the evening sky for 16 days before she disappears. That's 2 times 8. And then she was with the Sun for 8 days, so there's an 8, and then in the morning sky again for 16 days, so 2 times 8. And it's 8 years between Venus cycles, so 8 is a magic number for Venus. It's really significant, and it's interesting to see how that number plays out over and over again throughout the cycle. So one of the ways that we see that can happen is that because Venus will meet with the Moon 7 or 8 times in the morning sky after she goes direct. And something I forgot to mention, and I want to be sure everybody understands, is that there are a lot of ways of looking at the Venus cycle, and you may see other perspectives on. Some people start the Venus cycle when Venus and the Sun are conjunct. And they may have different ways of their understanding of the cycle. So what we're sharing with you is not the be-all end-all, but it is part of 20 years of research and working with the cycle and seeing what works and what really seems to be the ceremonial initiatory experience that people go through. And so we look at the Venus cycle as it rises into the morning sky, where it's visible as the beginning of the cycle, because that's how the ancient people did it. So that's a little bit different than you might find other people working with this particular cycle. And the other thing just to say is that, of course, I want to mention that Daniel Jamario, who is the founder of the Shamanic Astrology Paradigm, is the one who did initial research back in the mid-90s and started presenting this information and talking about this, and we started thinking about how to work with it ceremonially back then, and the evolution of how that's taken place has grown immensely over the years, and we're continually evolving our understanding. So what we're sharing with you now is our current understanding, and that might evolve as well. So again, it's not a static thing, so just keep that in mind as we go through this process. So at each gate, as we've already mentioned in the story of Inanna, she is giving up a vestment that represents a chakra, and that's about releasing distortions that might be related to that chakra energy, blocks, beliefs, pain, trauma, etc. And that to work with it in this way, to really take a time to be with it ceremonially, to work with the intent of that chakra gate, we have found to be really powerful and empowering for people. So now we're going to look at the Underworld Phase.
Yes, so in the longer Underworld Phase, this is when Venus is in the exterior conjunction with the sun. So Venus is passing behind the sun from our view. And so she's with the sun from 60 to 90 days. And we refer to this as the longer underworld. And this is this part of the story where Inanna dies and is reborn 60 to 90 days later, after she meets with the sun, or the source of life. And this is when Inanna is dying to her old self and preparing to be reborn anew. And this is really one of the most potent kinds of ways of looking at an underworld initiation, is to understand that that's when we are connected to the divine. We are in the heart of God, you could say, and whatever is no longer true, whatever is false is going to be burned away, is going to be illuminated. And Cayelin might talk a little more about that too, because this has been such a powerful recognition.
Right. So, if we think of the sun as the source, it is also a way of sourcing a new way of being with life. So we, burning away, as Tami was saying, burning away the old, like that alchemical cauldron. And what better alchemical cauldron could there be than the sun? And, that alchemy of where it's changing, something from one form to another, the base elements into gold. So this underworld time is extremely important. It's not easy necessarily, because there is a death process taking place, but it's also a rebirth process that follows. So that's we've found this to be an extremely magical, if we choose to look at it that way, transformative time to work with as part of the cycle. And then Venus rises up into the evening sky, and she begins to meet with the waxing moon 7 or 8 times. So you remember in the very beginning, we talked about the Venus. I showed you the Venus images of the Venus in the morning sky with the waning moon, and now she's in the evening sky with the waxing crescent moon. So this is where she gets to reclaim the vestments that she had to leave on the way down, and she's now reclaiming them from a place of being empowered, and so she is getting to reclaim a healthy relationship with each of these chakra energies in that ascent back up to the story of Inanna being Queen of Heaven. She is returning to be Queen of Heaven once again at that time. So I think now we're going to talk about the morning and evening star as it this story as it relates to the Inanna story.
Yes. So and so basically, yes, the Inanna story, descent story, is a literal description. Inanna literally meant Venus, same thing as Venus, of the morning and evening star cycle. And so the story, the Inanna story, begins where Inanna, the great Sumerian goddess and queen of heaven and earth, makes the choice to visit the underworld. And so you could say that during the retrograde phase, while Venus is, even as she rises as morning star, that's the point in the story where Inanna is making the choice. She is setting her ear to the great below, and she is preparing herself for her underworld journey. And then when Venus goes direct, that's when Inanna sets out for the underworld to visit her sister Ereshkigal, who is grieving the death of her husband, the great bull of heaven, Gugulanna, who also symbolizes the death or the end of the Taurian age, in some ways of looking at this, and the birth then of the Aries age, the age of Aries, which would have been a more patriarchal period, the initiation of that. And in these images you can see Gugulanna, the great bull of heaven, and Ereshkigal.
And so just to say, because Tami pronounces it Ereshkigal and I pronounce it Ereshkigal, there are at least two different ways to pronounce it, and there may be others. In fact, we don't really know how the Sumerians pronounced this name, and I've heard scholars that work with this cycle pronounce it both ways. So either way is correct. And again, we're looking at not one way, or one way is the right way, or not one way of looking at the cycle or being with the cycle or pronouncing the different names as the right or wrong way. So just so you keep that in mind, and why you might hear us saying those names differently because we just have chosen a different way. I first heard it as Ereshkigal, and so that's how it sticks in my mind. And Tami maybe first heard it as Ereshkigal, and that's how it sticks in her mind. So that's just the difference between those two. So Inanna then sets out for the underworld, and you could see here in this image that here is a woman standing in a boat. As she and in Sumer, they actually had locks and like a riverway or canals that went down into what they called the underworld. And so the way they imagined the story is that Inanna's in her boat going down to the underworld, literally through these locks or gates that would take you down to a lower level each time. And so you can also see the image of the moon here with Venus, and it kind of looks like the moon looks like this boat, looks similar to the boat, and Venus right there. And you can imagine that they could see that as Venus in the boat, or Inanna being in the boat. Now, the thing to keep in mind is that it doesn't always look this way. Sometimes you'll see Venus in the morning sky with the moon, and they're far apart, and the moon is tipped a different way. So it still always looks like that crescent, but it might be tipped in a different direction. So it's not always going to look that way, but apparently it looked that way when they were creating the story, and that reminded them of their own boats and locks, and so it connected to what was actually happening in their world. So again, Inanna sets out for the underworld. She's going through these different gates that symbolize the chakras. And when she arrives at the outer gates, she requests entrance like everybody else, or requests entrance. And she's told that she must enter like everyone else, and that each gate she is required to surrender one of her vestments. And at each gate she says, "What? What's going on? I don't, And she's told by Neti, I think, who's the gatekeeper, that not to question the ways of the underworld, that, just to this is what's happening, and just to deal with that. And so she does, because it's important for her to make this journey. She has made the choice to do the journey, so she's willing to follow the rules, so to speak, of what it takes to do the journey, to do this kind of initiation. So, and then as she's going through the first gate, this is where her crown is removed, and we see this as being symbolic of releasing the blocks that she may have to our authentic connection with the divine. And then at the next gate, this is, and each gate has a name. So the first gate is the gate of authority, and the next gate is the gate of perception, and they relate to the chakras. And then this is when the lapis measuring rod and line is removed from her. And so it's releasing distortions around her connection to magic and her ability to manifest. Something to also keep in mind is that these vestments, the crown is always the first gate, or the seventh gate on the way up, the first gate on the way down, the seventh gate on the way up, is always seen as the crown chakra. But the second gate, sometimes it's a measuring rod and line, sometimes it's earrings, sometimes it's a necklace. You'll see that there's different ways, different vestments that are, and from different tellings, or maybe from different translations of the story. So it's not a set, static thing. Then when she goes through the third gate, the gate of communication, she's surrendering the double-stranded beads. Usually they're called lapis lazuli beads, and this helps release the blocks and barriers to communicating the truth and authenticity of her being. And then the fourth gate, the gate of compassion, the heart chakra, where she releases the breastplate, come men come, and releasing all the ways she may not truly love herself or guards her heart. And then she'll go to the fifth gate, or the third chakra gate, the gate of personal power, and it might be a golden hip girdle, it might be a ring of power is removed, and this is a way of letting go of the way others have had power over her, or she's had power over others, or she gives her power away. And at the sixth gate, the gate of creativity, the ankle bracelets are removed, and this releases the way she no longer truly values herself, and how she really truly receives the experience of pleasure or not. So releasing the ways that she does not allow herself to experience pleasure is also included with this gate. And then at the seventh gate, the gate of manifestation, then the royal robe is removed from her, and that's stripping Inanna of her life force. And so then there's often an eighth gate. And so what we see is this gate is, and this has come to us from many synchronicities and understandings over the years, that this is the death by intent gate, meaning that there's an absolute choosing of dying at this point, like a total surrender. And the guard at this gate tells Inanna that to gain entrance here, it requires her willingness to really choose a conscious death. So she's, she knows that she's going to truly die to who she believes herself to be, and that she's absolutely choosing this as her initiation, and it in fact is a great test of surrender, and perhaps the greatest test of surrender she goes through as she's going into the underworld. So then she arrives in the underworld, and this is where Ereshkigal basically kills her and hangs her up on a meat hook. So with all of her vestments gone, she's vulnerable, and there's really nothing she can do but just accept the death that is there for her. But it is this process that must happen before we can actually experience rebirth. So Inanna's gift of this story, of this journey, is to remind us that when we really work with the wisdom of surrender, we trust the process and we go with the flow, then we can make this passage into an entirely new, more empowered and magical way of being. When we emerge up out of the death process and are born anew, then we are born into who we truly are, and not who we believe ourselves to be, that may not be actually who we are, but we are more connected to the divine essence, and also able to fulfill the divine purpose that we have come to fulfill.
So at this stage in the story, when she's in the underworld and she's undergone her death process, in an earlier phase of the story, actually, just to back up for a moment, when Inanna chooses to go to the underworld, she asks her maidservant Ninshabar, who actually represents Mercury, that if she doesn't return, that Ninshabar should go for help after 3 days if she doesn't return. So Ninshabar does this after Inanna doesn't return for 3 days, and she goes to many gods asking for help, and finally Enki, the god of water and wisdom, agrees to help, and he sends two little beings to bring the waters of life to restore Inanna in the story. And in the story itself, in many versions, it says there are 60 sprinklings of water that bring Inanna back to life. And there's more to this story, so we'll recommend reading it. But the 60 sprinklings also can be connected to the 60 days in the underworld. And so then Inanna is brought back to life, and she then begins her Ascent Journey, where she returns through the first gate, once again, the gate of manifestation, where she retrieves her royal robe or her garment of ladyship, and she reclaims her healthy potency and life force expression. And then she returns to the second gate, the gate of creativity, and retrieves her ankle bracelets, reclaiming her ability to truly value and cherish herself and experience pleasure. And then she returns to the third gate, the gate of personal power, where she retrieves the golden hip girdle or the gold ring of power, and regains access to her fullest expression of personal power. And then she returns again through the fourth gate, reclaiming her breastplate called Come Man Come, and choosing to become centered in her heart and embodying radiant radical self-love. And then through the fifth gate, the gate of communication, retrieving the double-stranded beads around her neck and reclaiming healthy, authentic communication of her true self. And then she returns to the sixth gate, the gate of perception, retrieving the lapis measuring rod, inline ore, the small lapis bead earrings, reclaiming her sense of magic and her ability to manifest. And then, when she returns through the seventh gate, the gate of authority, Inanna retrieves the Shagora, or the crown of the steps, as it was referred to, and which symbolizes her reconnection to heaven and to her own godhood. And then at this point, if there is an eighth gate, Inanna sees this eighth gate before her, and the guardian reminds her she is about to pass through the gate of ascension. And this is possible because, and only because, she has successfully encountered her underworld initiation and is ready to claim her place as fully initiated queen of heaven and earth. And this time, as she looks around, she sees that there are many others who are now stepping through this gateway with her. Because, of course, Inanna is each of us. And at this point, at this time, we are now remembering this ancient practice. And there are many of us who are going through this conscious descent and ascent through the Inanna Venus mystery. So as Inanna ascends, returning to the heavens, she reclaims her place as Queen of Heaven and Earth, and now she has the knowledge and experience of pain and darkness, having experienced them for herself, and the wisdom that originally orchestrated her descent into the underworld also arranges for her return. So after passing through the 7 gateways, Inanna again has encountered all of her shadowed parts, the uncertainties of who she really was, and this again is also part of what we invoke through our own journeys personally and collectively as ceremony.
And then the cycle begins again. Woohoo! So we get many opportunities to do this journey, and so for people who are in an 8-year Venus return, these are very powerful to work with personally, but also just to work with collectively, because of course that's what the Sumerians and Babylonians did. And what we thought would be interesting to do would be just to look at the Babylonian story, how they described it for Ishtar, because there's a few little differences, and it just kind of gives you a sense of how the story can be told in different ways and how you might experience it. So Ishtar is going to the underworld to look for her husband, Tammuz. She's in search of her husband. And she also prepares for the journey. She's making the choice to go, and she dresses up in all her finest vestments and then sets out for the dark cavern that leads to the underworld. And when she arrives at the first gate, she demands that the gatekeeper, Nidu, a little bit different name but kind of similar as Neti, that he or she open the gate for her to enter. And Nidu asks Ishtar to wait while he consults with the Queen of the Underworld. And the Queen of the Underworld in this story is Urkala, sister to Ishtar. So it's the same, the dark sister, the sister of the underworld and the sister of the heavens. And sometimes actually you will read that Urkala, they will call her Ereshkigal or Ereshkigal, that's the same. It's used interchangeably, interestingly enough. So just something to be aware of. And then she goes through each of the gates and has to release a vestment. So in this version of the story, it's the splendid crown, the necklace with the 8-rayed star, the bracelets of gold and lapis lazuli, shoes, which is the first time I had seen that particular vestment described, a veil, and outer robe and garment at the descending gates. So something just to notice that there's different ways of working with these vestments. There's not just one way to do it. That we have many different images we can work with, and one of the ways I have suggested to people is they could maybe work with chakra stones as vestments if they don't have something that feels like it represents that particular chakra. Using colored stones that represent the chakras. So Urkala is similar to Ereshkigal, curses Ishtar and summons the plague demon to afflict her, causing Ishtar to die. And so Ishtar then no longer sees the light. Feathers come upon her, and then she ate dust and fed upon mud. Doesn't feel like or seem like a very lovely experience, but this was her fate. And so she's not hung up on a meat hook. It's not described as being hung up on a meat hook like Inanna, but she's got a pretty underworld kind of existence going on. Meanwhile, Shamash, who is the Lord of the Sun, notices that Ishtar's absence is having a huge effect on the world, and he determines that that this creation is going to die. The creatures in this creation, this whole entire creation, is going to end if Ishtar does not return. So he sends Ea to conjure the water of life from Urkala and revive Ishtar, And so then Ishtar is reborn and returns to the heaven. And of course, this is just another version of Vestments. As she's returning through the first gate, she gets back her breechcloth instead of royal robe. At the second gate, she's getting back clasps for her hands and feet, which might be similar to ankle bracelets. At the third gate, she's getting a birthstone girdle for her hips, which might be similar to a golden waist belt. At the fourth gate, she is getting ornaments for her breasts, which is similar to a breastplate. At the fifth gate, she's getting chains of beads for her neck, similar to a lapis lazuli double-stranded beads that she was wearing around her neck. At the sixth gate, she retrieves pendants for her ears, and that's similar to what's also sometimes said for the Inanna story, although usually most interpretations I've read does describe the measuring rod, the staff that she has. And then at the seventh gate, she gets back her great crown, so symbolizing, of course, her return to and connection to the divine. So that's just another version and way of looking at the story. And again, just the part of the reason we wanted to bring this to you is so that you can see there is no right or wrong way. There's no just one way of working with the story. And that we get to tune into what works for us and how it works for us. And that helps to inform us. We're informed by the Venus cycle, and then we help to inform the Venus cycle as we work with it. So now I think we're ready to talk about the 8-year return and the overtones.
Yes. So we're now at the phase where we can kind of look at the bigger patterns of the Venus cycle. So the thing to understand is that when in Venus's path around the sun, she goes through 5 cycles of 584 days. We've talked about each of these individual cycles, but there are 5 cycles that repeat over 8 years, creating a 5-pointed star or pentagram. And this is the symbol that has long been associated with the goddess. So basically, if you look at each of the 5 points of this pentacle, they would represent, and Cayelin will talk more about this as well, each of those points where Venus rises as morning star. So one of the points will be where Venus rises as morning star in a certain season in August at this time in the sign of Leo. That's one of the points. Another point will be when Venus rises as morning star in what is currently June in the sign of Gemini. And so every 8 years, Venus will have gone through each of these morning star rises, and it will shift very slightly about every cycle. Every 8 years, Venus will begin her rise about 2 days before she rose that other time. And so that creates kind of the interesting pattern you see that's shifting in these above images of the pentagram and how it kind of moves and shifts. So this one pattern, just wanted to say, this pattern where you see the rose, the pentacle, at the 5-petaled rose thing at the center here, and then it kind of stretches out and it comes back around, and so it's like it's creating in the sky. We see that it's continually creating the pentagram, but it's moving through its different patterns before it returns back, and it creates this beautiful rose pattern that we see in the sky. Yes, and just to understand as well that what we're describing in this very short video is it has gone into in much greater detail when you study shamanic astrology. There is a much more in-depth version that we would go through, but that this is the very simplest version. Right. So, you're getting the Reader's Digest version. Yes. Yes. Right. So one of the most exciting things to consider is that is the Venus Synodic cycle overtone. And when I say that, I mean that when, as I mentioned before, when Venus rises as morning star, a new cycle and begins a new cycle, whatever sign Venus is in at that time is the overtone for the full 540-day cycle. So kind of like the way that a new moon, you could say, some people would say that the sign of the new moon kind of sets this undertone for, an overtone for the month. You can say the same thing with the Venus cycle, that whatever sign Venus rises in, and that will have to do, of course, with the season that Venus rises in, that creates the overtone for the full cycle. So in other words, the sign Venus rises in represents the goddess or the leading lady who is active on the world stage for about 19 months. Because again, we're looking at Venus as representing the divine feminine. So the archetype of the divine feminine is the feminine archetype. The overtone is the feminine archetype that's being integrated into the collective psyche or culture over the entire time of the synodic cycle. And so one of the layers that Cayelin and I have been really moved to experience is that as we've engaged people collectively and created a very in-depth process for this, that we've seen that the descent process, as we go through each of the gates, working with a different sign. We began with Capricorn, for example, that this was a time for us to actively and consciously strip away the cultural distortions and what you could call the patriarchal overlay that's connected to each of those signs. So, for example, in working with Capricorn, we came to recognize, especially at certain chakra gates, that one of the distortions of Capricorn is a doing addiction, that's part of the patriarchal overlay. And so part of our activation and part of our intent collectively was to perceive of that, to experience that, and then to actively release that distortion, to work towards that. So then the ascent process is the evolutionary birth and emergence of the new feminine archetypal expression of that sign, supporting the evolving new culture at the turning of the ages. And I suspect Cayelin will want to talk about that also, because it's really, there's so much juice there.
Yeah, so let's just kind of look first at what are the different archetypal signs that we're working with in the current pentagram. And as we mentioned, over time, it does shift. The points that are rising, where Venus is rising in the sky does shift over time. I think it's about 1,260 years for it to make one entire rotation. So, and about maybe 100 to 104 years in one particular sign. And that's, again, these are averages, so it's not always exactly the same numbers, but those are the average numbers. So in this image, you can see on January 17th, 2014, and this is the Venus cycle that actually began the whole process. Venus rose as a morning star at 18 Capricorn. And 8 years later, on January 15th, just, not quite exactly 8 years, but within a couple of days, 2.5 days or so, Venus is rising as a morning star at 15 Capricorn. And then Venus was in this Capricorn overtone from January 17th, 2014 to August 21st, 2015, about a year and a half, or around 19 months. And then on August 22nd, 2015, Venus rose as a morning star at 19 Leo, and that became the overtone for that cycle. And then there's about a 19-month period, and on March 31st, 2017, Venus rises at 1 degree Aries. And because it's precessing, when we see those lower numbers, we know that it's about to shift into the next sign. So 2017 will be the last time that Venus will rise in Aries and have an Aries overtone. And then the next cycle, 8 years later, will be in the sign of Pisces. So that'll be a big shift that'll take place at that time. And then we come across to see on November 2nd, 2018, Venus will rise at 29 degrees Libra. And this is also a shift because the overtone has been Scorpio since the 1920s or 30s. I think it's the 1920s. And then it's just now shifting, because it would be about 100 years, so it's probably 1920, that it's been in the Scorpio overtone, and now it's shifting to the Libra overtone. And then about 19 months later, on June 10th, 2020, Venus will rise in the morning sky at 10 degrees Gemini. 19 months after that, on January 15th, 2022, it will rise in Capricorn, and the whole process will begin again over the next 8 years. So it does take 8 years for Venus to return to any one of these points to begin the cycle there. And the other thing that happens is that on your birthday, if you are turning a multiple of 8, and I love to count by 8, so 8, 16, 24, 32, 40, 48, 56, 64, 72, 80, 88, and 96, though if you are turning a multiple of that number during one of these 19-month windows, then you will have Venus returning very close to where it was at the time you were born. The only exception to that is if you were born with Venus retrograde, and then it gets a little trickier. It's not always as exact, but I'm an evening star Venus, and it comes back within a couple of days pretty much every time. So most people have that experience. And just the other thing to say quickly is that the overtone for the Leo cycle was Virgo until 1975. And the the Capricorn overtone was Aquarius until 1974. And so we can see that, these are also fairly recently shifted into new archetypes. And so that is something that's continually happening, and all the archetypes do get represented over time.
So that's kind of a really actually a very simple way of looking at the bigger Venus cycle pattern. And now just to understand that when the Sumerians were honoring and creating their stories about Inanna, part of why this is such an exciting thing that we're doing now to revive a reenactment of the full Venus Synodic cycle as ceremony collectively is because the ancient Sumerians, every 8 years, when Venus would rise at the spring equinox, they would do a reenactment of the Inanna descent. It was a big cultural kind of festival. It was a big cultural happening. It was a big collective event. And that was because at that time, at the spring equinox, that was the point at which the equinox would align to the galactic edge, the galactic center, the galactic edge, which is a very significant period. And so now enough time has passed that according to shamanic astrology and this way of looking at it, it's quite possible that the winter solstice is now kind of the point of power, indicating an age change, in part because now the winter and the summer solstice are aligned to the galactic edge and the galactic center, the galactic poles. And so because of this, when we first began working with the Capricorn cycle, we came to feel that this Capricorn cycle was the master cycle and that it guided all of the others. And in Daniel Giamario's kind of looking at renewing the new version of Capricorn, which is essential to do at the turning of the ages, he came to believe that Capricorn is actually, obviously it's a feminine sign, and it is to be in service to the circle of the grandmothers and the next 7 generations. And so we very actively called on the circle of the grandmothers in our first class, our first series, and felt that we had been called by them. They've been very, very active. And we came to believe that it was the Capricorn cycle that guided all of the other 5, and that the circle of the grandmothers are also guiding all 5 Venus Synodic cycle initiations. And so with gratitude and praises, we invite in the circle of the grandmothers for each of these cycles.
Yes, yay. And they've been so awesome. I mean, and we have a picture or image here of the 13 indigenous grandmothers. And we're not limiting to that, but we just wanted to give a visual, like, yes, there are a circle of grandmothers, and they can be cross-cultural, and we can work with this grandmother energy in whatever way really speaks to us. It might be a lineage of our own grandmothers. It might be that there are grandmothers in our life that that have adopted us. I have some grandmothers in my life that have adopted me. And like to support me and give me guidance and information. So there's many different ways we can work with this grandmother energy. And that's something that we've been doing and having such fun with and creating as we go forward. And the fact that this grandmother energy, the wisdom, that elder wisdom, that grandmother wisdom is with us through all of these Venus cycles. It's very exciting.
And actually, in working with it, one of the ways that I came to look at it is that the grandmothers may, in fact, be our DNA. They might be the part of us that can really connect to the past and also is dreaming into the future with us. So that's also another way to look at it.
Yes, I love that. That's beautiful. So as we wrap this up, there's a few additional resources. Of course, many of you watching this will already be in the Venus journey with me and Tami. If you're watching this and you're not, you can go to venusalchemy.com, and we are working ceremonially with this cycle each step of the way, and giving you lots of tools and insights and ways of working with each overtone, as well as that personal sense of having a collective group, or the power of it, the intention of, and ceremonial intent of a huge group of people to work with. So we encourage you to check that out if you're not a part of it already. Also, there's a book by Diane Wilkstein and Samuel Kramer called Inanna, Queen of Heaven and Earth, Her Stories and Hymns from Sumer. Excellent book, and a lot of the information that we use for this class does come from this book. Also inspired by Descent to the Goddess, A Way of Initiation for Women by Sylvia Pereira, who really doesn't talk about Venus in connection to the Inanna story, but she talks about the psychological benefits of working with this mythic story as a way to empower women through an initiatory experience. And then Ishtar Rising by Robert Anton Wilson is a great book that talks about Ishtar from the perspective of Ishtar, and working with this imagery from also kind of a ceremonial and psychological point of view. So that really covers our very quick, something we might talk about over a 2 or 3 day period in terms of the cycle, but it should give you the essence of what the cycle is about, so that it helps support you in working with this cycle. Is there anything you want to add, Tami, before we close?
I think the only thing is just, again, to reiterate the gratitude for the lineage. I would give such gratitude to all the work that Cayelin's done to help create this over the last 20 years, and that also to, again, Daniel Giamario for really bringing this groundbreaking work in, and remembering, helping so many of us now to remember the connection between the Inanna descent story and the Venus Synodic cycle, and bringing the Synodic cycle back into the collective awareness.
Yes, thank you, Daniel. Awesome. So until we meet again, this is Cayelin and Tami signing off. Bye, everyone.
Bye.